My name is Ethan Hayes. At 36, I am the president of BioCore Innovations, a medical technology firm valued at over $1 billion, with its headquarters here in Seattle, Washington. Looking at me now from my chair in an office walled with glass that overlooks the vast expanse of Puget Sound, you would likely see a man who has achieved everything he set out to conquer. It's an easy assumption to make, but that perception is a fragile illusion. If you could see the truth etched into parts of me that are invisible to the eye, you would know the path that brought me to this high rise was anything but straightforward. The road to this office was a brutal climb, paved with struggle and haunted by nights spent staring into the darkness. Even now, certain memories from my boyhood can slice through me with the sharp, cold precision of a surgeon's knife, a pain that time has never managed to dull. I need to take you back to where it all began, to the deepest shadows of my past. My story truly starts with me as a small boy, consumed by fear and a crippling lack of worth, living under the suffocating presence of the man I was forced to call my father. My life began in what should have been a paradise, a sprawling estate in Medina, a place of stunning beauty where majestic evergreens lined serpentine roads that hugged the water's edge. To any outsider, it was an idyllic world, yet all that opulent beauty served only to mask the deep fractures running through our family. It was a house filled with exquisite things but devoid of any warmth. The man at the center of this charade was my father, David Hayes. He was the founder of BioCore Innovations, which at that point was still a fledgling but fiercely ambitious medical device company. His physical presence was imposing, tall with chiseled features, but it was his eyes that truly commanded a room. They were cold, penetrating things that had a way of looking right through you, making you feel utterly insignificant. To the world, he was a celebrated genius, a pillar of the community. In private, however, he was the source of my deepest fears. The memory that branded this truth onto my soul is seared into my mind. I was only 6, huddled on the grand wooden staircase that overlooked our living room. Below, a crystal chandelier showered the room in a cold, brilliant light, glinting off the collection of expensive wine bottles on the grand table. My father, his words slurred with alcohol, caught sight of me. He raised a hand not to wave, but to point a rigid finger directly at my small frame. "You bastard!" he bellowed, his voice cracking through the house. "You are no son of mine!" The words weren't just spoken. They were a projectile, a physical force that struck me where I sat, and a tremor ran through my entire body. I had no idea what the word bastard meant, but his expression needed no translation. The pure, undiluted contempt in his gaze, a look of utter disgust, was enough to break something inside my 6-year-old heart. My mother, Clara, was there in an instant, sweeping me into her arms. I buried my face against her, trying to disappear as she whispered fiercely into my hair. "Don't you listen to him, my darling. You are my whole world." Her words were a balm, but the wound was already too deep to be healed by comfort alone. That single ugly word my father had thrown at me became a brand on my soul, a curse that would cling to me for years. She was the solitary point of light in the suffocating darkness of my childhood. My mother was a woman of quiet grace, with hair the color of pale gold and a smile that felt like the only source of warmth in that cold, cavernous house. She was my constant defender, always finding small ways to shield me, even when it meant placing herself in the path of his volatile anger. I can still picture her so clearly on those nights, tiptoeing into my room long after my father's drunken snores had begun to rattle the walls. She would sit on the edge of my bed, her hand gently stroking my hair, and her soft voice would fill the silence with tales from books, stories of brave heroes who conquered impossible odds. "You are so much stronger than you know, Ethan," she would tell me, her voice a promise in the dark. One day you are going to do magnificent things. I held onto those words as if they were a raft in a storm. I wanted to believe her, I truly did, but it was no use. The echo of my father's disgust was always louder than her gentle reassurances. Deep in my core, I felt hollowed out, a fraud who could never be worthy of the fierce love she gave me. The small, fragile world of our home held one other person. My younger brother, Leo. Leo was 4 years my junior, and from the day he came home from the hospital, the entire axis of our family life shifted to orbit around him. He was a miniature version of my father, blessed with the same striking blue eyes and an easy, magnetic smile. He moved through the world with a self-assurance that I could only watch with a sense of wonder and bewilderment. My father's affection for Leo was absolute and unconditional. It was as if Leo represented every hope and ambition David Hayes had ever harbored for himself. Leo was showered with expensive gifts and whisked away on international trips while I was consistently left behind. The justification was always the same hollow excuse. You need to stay home and focus on your studies. It wasn't jealousy, not in the simple sense of the word. I didn't resent Leo for what he had. What I craved with an ache that was a constant presence in my chest was for my father to look at me just once without that familiar flicker of contempt in his eyes. I just wanted him to see me, not the disappointment he had decided I was. Drowned in our father's adoration and our mother's compensatory affection, Leo grew into a boy with a sharp, arrogant edge. He delighted in my quiet nature, labeling me a weirdo for preferring books to boisterous games. He would point and laugh if I stumbled or fell, and one afternoon he stood before me and methodically ripped my most treasured book to shreds, page by page. "You think you're so much smarter than me?" he sneered, his voice dripping with a challenge I didn't know how to meet. I said nothing. I just dropped my head, hoping he wouldn't see the hot tears welling in my eyes. My mother always stepped in, attempting to broker peace between us, but it was a futile effort. Leo knew with an unshakable certainty that he had our father's unconditional support, and this knowledge only emboldened him. But Leo's taunts were nothing compared to what I truly dreaded: my father's physical rage. He wasn't violent often, but the unpredictability of it was a constant low-level hum of terror in my life. When his anger did erupt, it felt like the foundations of my world were crumbling beneath my feet. I remember one evening vividly. We were hosting a party for his company associates, and in a moment of clumsiness, I knocked over and shattered an expensive crystal glass. The sound seemed to stop time. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep, and dragged me into his private study, slamming the heavy wooden door behind us. The silence was terrifying. "Who do you think you are?" he roared, his face a mask of fury. "Embarrassing me in front of everyone like that?" The slap came without warning, a sharp, cracking sound that sent me sprawling onto the thick carpet. My cheek was on fire, a searing physical pain, but it was nothing compared to the agony of the look in his eyes. He stared down at me not as a father at a son, but as if I were some loathsome creature, an object of pure disgust. My mother burst into the room then, her voice a desperate cry for him to stop, but he just shoved her out of his way, his verbal assault continuing unabated. Later, after he had stormed out, my mother would gather me into her arms, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. Her tears fell onto my head as she whispered over and over, "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I'm so sorry I can't protect you." In the quiet of my room, I would lie awake, the questions swirling in my mind. What had I done that was so unforgivable? Why did my father hate me with such intensity? And what did he mean when he called me a bastard? The word hung in the air, a mystery I was terrified to solve. Those questions became an obsession, gnawing at me until I was lost in a fog of relentless self-doubt. A part of me began to accept his verdict as truth. I must be worthless, Maybe I really was a mistake, an ugly blemish on the otherwise pristine image of his family. But my mother was always there, a steady hand pulling me back from the edge before I could fall too far into that despair. She taught me how to find my footing again, how to build a world for myself within the pages of books and the quiet pursuit of knowledge. She showed me that there was a joy to be found there, a place where I could dream without fear. "You don't have to be like anyone else, Ethan," she would insist, her voice firm. "You just need to be yourself. Your own path will find you." And so my studies became my sanctuary. It was the one place where I felt competent, where I felt safe. I threw myself into my schoolwork, losing myself in textbooks, equations, and complex problems as if my life depended on it. In a way, it did. It felt like the only currency I had to prove my own value. I consistently achieved the highest marks, standing at the top of every class, but it never made a difference to my father. "What's the point of all those good grades?" he scoffed one evening, his voice laced with its usual brand of derision. "Leo is the one who will take over this company one day." Each word was a fresh cut, a sharp twist of the knife he had already lodged in my heart. But I refused to let him see me bleed. I would not give up. I had to prove him wrong, to show him that I was more than the useless burden he saw. More importantly, I had to make my mother proud. Then when I was 14, something happened that changed everything. Leo, who was only 10 at the time, was the center of attention at his extravagant birthday party. In a fit of childish pique, he deliberately flung a large piece of his birthday cake, hitting one of my father's most important business partners square in the chest. My father's face went rigid with fury. But instead of directing his anger at Leo, the actual culprit, he spun around and fixed his ice-cold glare on me. "Why weren't you watching him?" he roared, his voice echoing through the stunned silence of the living room. He didn't wait for an answer. His hand shot out and he slapped me hard, right there in front of dozens of guests. I just stood there, my cheeks stinging, the humiliation a hot flush spreading across my entire body. I could feel tears pressing against the back of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. It wasn't a show of strength, it was a survival mechanism. I had simply learned to push all my feelings down, to bury them so deep no one could ever use them against me. My mother rushed to my side, her arm circling my shoulders, and guided me out of the room. As soon as we were alone, she held me close. "You will not have to live like this forever," she whispered fiercely, her voice trembling. "One day you will be free of this place." Her words felt like a solemn vow, planting a tiny, fragile seed of hope in the barren landscape of my heart. For the first time, I began to truly imagine a future for myself, a life lived far away from the suffocating weight of my father's presence. I dreamed of a day when I could simply be myself, without the constant fear of a blow or a public humiliation. What I couldn't possibly know then was that in just a few short years, I would suffer a far greater tragedy. A loss that would extinguish the only light I had ever known, sending me spiraling into a journey of unimaginable pain, but also eventually of profound resilience. By the time I was 15, I had mastered the art of survival in that cold, loveless house. I had given up trying to win my father's approval and had finally abandoned the fantasy that Leo might one day see me as a brother instead of an obstacle. My world had contracted and I funneled every ounce of my energy into my schoolwork. Textbooks, complex equations, and long research papers were my only refuge. Every A on a report card, every compliment from a teacher was another stone laid in the fortress I was building around myself, a wall designed to deflect the sting of my father's disdain. My ambition was no longer just about getting out of Medina. It was about something deeper. I was studying to prove to myself more than anyone that I was not the worthless creature he had branded me. I was not a bastard. My high school was a pressure cooker, a place where the privileged children of Seattle's most powerful families vied for dominance. I navigated its halls like a ghost. I had no real friends, not because I was antisocial, but because I simply didn't know how to bridge the chasm that separated me from them. The other students would gather in cliques talking about their summer homes in the San Juan Islands or the brand new sports cars their parents had gifted them for their birthdays. My own world consisted of dog-eared library books and a silent, desperate dream of a future where all of this was just a distant memory. But that profound isolation forged me into who I would become. I learned to depend only on myself, to find my own 2 feet, and to metabolize pain and turn it into fuel. My mother was the only person who saw me, who truly understood the boy behind the stoic facade. She was a constant presence at school functions, sitting in the audience for every academic awards assembly that my father deemed beneath his notice. I'll never forget the afternoon I was given the school's top academic prize for my year. As my name was called, my mother shot to her feet, clapping so loudly that a few people turned to look. Her eyes were shining with a pride that felt more valuable than any trophy. Afterward, she drove me to a little ice cream parlor down by the waterfront. As we sat there, she reached across the small table and took my hand. "You make me so incredibly proud, Ethan," she said, her grip firm and reassuring. "Don't you ever for 1 second let anyone convince you that you are not more than good enough." Those small, stolen moments of peace were my lifeblood. They were the doses of medicine that gave me the will to endure. When I was 17, with my heart in my throat, I submitted my application to Stanford. It felt less like a plan and more like a desperate prayer. It was my most audacious dream, but it was also a tremendous risk. When my father found out about my application, he didn't even try to hide his contempt. "Stanford?" he scoffed, the word dripping with derision. "You really think you have what it takes to get into a place like that? Just don't embarrass the family name when they reject you." Leo, by then a cocky teenager who had mastered our father's dismissive tone, just laughed. "If you get into Stanford," he said, "I'll eat my own shoes." But my mother never wavered. She was my champion. She sat with me for hours, helping me refine my application, poring over every essay and meticulously checking every line. "You deserve this, Ethan," she told me, her belief in me a tangible force. "You are going to get in." The day the thick acceptance packet from Stanford arrived in the mail, I couldn't bring myself to open it. I just sat on my bed, staring at the envelope, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs when I finally tore it open and my eyes found the words, "Congratulations, Ethan Hayes, on your admission." I didn't shout with excitement. I broke down and sobbed. The tears weren't for joy, but for the immense, crushing weight of relief that washed over me. For the very first time in my 17 years, I felt a flicker of genuine self-worth. I scrambled downstairs, clutching the letter, and found my mother in the living room. When I showed it to her, she threw her arms around me, holding me tight as her own tears streamed down her face. "I knew it," she whispered into my hair. "I knew you could do it." My father, who was also in the room, gave the letter a cursory glance, mumbled something unintelligible, and then simply turned his back on us. Leo just shrugged, as if my acceptance to one of the most prestigious universities in the world was a minor event, unworthy of his notice. Stanford wasn't just a school, it was my liberation. When I left Medina that fall, stepping onto the campus in Palo Alto, it felt like I was being reborn into a new life. The sprawling grounds with their iconic sandstone architecture and palm-lined avenues felt like the first place I had ever truly fit. It was a world away from the oppressive quiet of my childhood home. I decided to major in business not solely because it was the logical path for someone connected to BioCore Innovations, but because I was driven by a deep personal need to understand the mechanics of power and success. I wanted to learn how to build something from the ground up, how to transform a mere idea into a tangible reality. Most of all, I wanted to prove once and for all that I was more than the failure my father had always seen. At Stanford, I came alive. It was like I had been holding my breath my entire life and could finally exhale. I threw myself into my studies, spending long nights in the library, joining academic clubs, and taking a part-time job shelving books to pay for my own expenses. I was determined not to depend on my father's money. He sent me a meager monthly allowance, but each transfer was accompanied by a terse note reminding me of the debt I owed him for my upbringing. His words were meant to sting, but they only hardened my resolve. Through sheer hard work and academic performance, I managed to secure a full scholarship, which granted me a sense of independence I had never before experienced. It was intoxicating, but even 3,000 miles away in Cambridge, the shadow of my father was long. Every phone call home was a fresh reminder of his disapproval. His voice was always cold, laced with a familiar critical edge. "So what exactly are you learning at that overpriced school?" he would ask, his tone implying that my entire education was a frivolous waste of his time and resources. Leo never bothered to call, but my mother's pained updates painted a clear picture. He was becoming more and more reckless, staying out all night at parties and burning through my father's money with abandon. I could hear the worry in my mother's voice, but she was helpless. My father indulged Leo's every whim, refusing to see any fault in his favored son. All I could do was offer hollow words of comfort over the phone, promising I would be home soon to help her manage things. My mother was my anchor, the one thing that kept me from drifting into despair. She sent me handwritten letters every single month, filled with small, intimate details of her life. The progress of the flowers in her garden, descriptions of the new novels she was reading. I have kept every single one of those letters. They are my most precious possessions, stored safely in a small wooden box. In my darkest moments of exhaustion and doubt, I would take them out and read her words, her love reaching across the miles to give me strength. "You are my hope, Ethan," she wrote in one of her last letters. "No matter how difficult things become, please know that I am always with you." I had no way of knowing how those beautiful, encouraging words would soon transform into a source of unbearable pain. I was 20 years old. It was a cold, gray April day in Cambridge, and I was buried deep in the stacks of the university library cramming for my midterm exams when my phone vibrated. The call was from a number I didn't recognize, but a strange premonition made me answer it. A woman's voice, unsteady and choked with emotion, came through the line. "Ethan," she said, "and this is a friend of your mother's. Something has happened." In that instant, my heart simply stopped beating. The woman on the phone, her voice breaking, explained that my mother, Clara, had been on her way to visit me for the weekend. The small private jet she was traveling on had experienced a catastrophic failure just minutes after taking off from the airport in Seattle. There were no survivors. I have no memory of dropping the phone. I don't remember stumbling out of the library, the world a blur as hot tears streamed down my face. The only thing I can recall from that moment is the visceral, all-consuming sensation of my entire world imploding. My mother, the only person in my life who had ever truly loved me, the one human being who had believed in my worth, was gone, and she was never coming back. I never had the chance to say goodbye. I never got to tell her one last time how much she meant to me, how much I loved her. All that remained were her letters, the fading echo of her voice in my memory, and a hollow, aching void in my chest that I knew would never be filled. I took the first flight back to Seattle that night, my mind a complete and utter blank. I was in a state of shock, moving on autopilot. When I finally walked through the front door of that cold, familiar house, my father was sitting in the living room, a half-empty glass of scotch in his hand, his eyes bloodshot. Leo stood silently in a corner, his head bowed, but there were no tears on his face. Neither of them looked up as I entered. No one said a word of greeting. No one asked me if I was okay. My father finally raised his head, his gaze locking onto mine, and then he spoke the words that I will carry with me to my grave. "If you hadn't insisted she come visit you," he said, his voice flat and dead, "she would still be alive." The words were a physical blow, a blade that slid between my ribs and twisted. A white-hot rage flared inside me. I wanted to scream at him, to hit him, to make him feel a fraction of the agony that was tearing me apart. But I did nothing. I just stood there, frozen in the doorway, and let the pain wash over me until I thought I would drown in it. My mother's funeral was a grand, ostentatious affair, perfectly in keeping with my father's public persona. It was a performance, designed to project an image of the perfect grieving Hayes family for the benefit of the watching world. I stood beside her casket, my eyes fixed on the smiling photograph of her they had placed on an easel, and felt as if a vital part of my own soul had been buried along with her. Leo, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, made a brief appearance, and then slipped away with a group of his friends. My father moved through the crowd of mourners, shaking hands with his business associates, treating my mother's memorial service like just another networking opportunity to be managed. I was the only one who remained by her side until the very end, clutching the memory of her warmth like a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood. In the aftermath of the funeral, what little remained of my relationship with my father disintegrated completely. He held me responsible for her death, and in the darkest corners of my grief, I started to believe he was right. The questions haunted me. If I hadn't gone so far away to Stanford, if I hadn't been so selfish as to want her to visit, would she still be alive? The guilt was a constant, corrosive presence in my gut, but that same guilt became my new fuel. I went back to Palo Alto with a grim, unshakable determination. I would not allow my mother's sacrifice to be for nothing. I would achieve everything I had ever dreamed of, not just for my own sake anymore, but for hers. The remaining years at Stanford were a blur of relentless effort. I buried myself in my work, studying with a fierce, obsessive focus, taking on extra projects, working until I was too exhausted to think, too exhausted to feel. It was the only way I knew to keep the pain at bay. I graduated at the top of my class with the highest honors and immediately enrolled in Stanford's MBA program, determined to push myself even further. I stopped calling home. I severed all ties with my father and with Leo. The only connection I had left to that life was my mother's box of letters, which became my sacred text. But the deep, hollow loneliness was a constant companion. Every night as I lay in my Spartan dorm room, my thoughts would inevitably turn to my mother. I would see her smile, hear the echo of her voice. "You are so much stronger than you know." She had told me that so many times. I held on to those words, repeating them to myself like a mantra, using them to pull myself out of bed each morning and face another day. I began to consciously cultivate relationships with my professors and a select few classmates, people who would one day become crucial allies. One of these was a man named Robert Sterling, the father of one of my peers and a highly respected venture capitalist with a reputation for spotting talent. He took an interest in me, recognizing a drive that mirrored his own. I sensed even then that he would be an essential part of the larger strategy I was beginning to formulate. When the day came for me to receive my master's degree, I stood on the graduation stage and scanned the crowd of proud families. There was no one there for me. No one from my family had come. My father didn't bother to call. Leo, I was sure, didn't even know what day it was. And my mother, the one person whose pride would have meant everything, was gone. I stood on that stage alone, my diploma in hand, a tight, artificial smile fixed on my face for the cameras. But beneath the surface, a cold resolve was solidifying within me. This was not an ending. This was the start of the real fight. My mother had taught me how to endure, how to be resilient, and I would now take that strength and use it to face the battles that lay ahead. It was a path that I knew with absolute certainty would lead me straight back to BioCore Innovations, back to where the nightmare had begun. And when I returned, I would finally confront my father and my brother, not as the scared little boy they remembered, but as a man prepared for war. I arrived back in Seattle on a blistering summer afternoon. The oppressive July heat seemed to press down on the city, but it was nothing compared to the fire of ambition and vengeance that burned inside me. My Stanford MBA was packed away in my luggage, but holding it didn't bring the feeling of victory I had once dreamed it would. Instead, as I stepped out of the taxi, I felt like a gladiator entering the Colosseum. I knew my adversaries were not just David and Leo Hayes, but the ghosts of my own past and the deep, painful wounds of my childhood. BioCore Innovations, the company my father had clawed into existence from nothing, was the very same place where I had first been branded with that hateful word. I was now walking back through its doors, not to plead for a scrap of his acceptance, but to demonstrate unequivocally that I had a right to be there, whether he liked it or not. The summons from my father came just a few weeks after I had graduated. I was still in Palo Alto, packing up the few belongings in my small apartment, my future an unwritten page. The phone rang and his voice, as cold and clipped as I remembered, came through the line. "Come home," he said, foregoing any sort of greeting or preamble. "The company needs people." He paused, then added, "And don't think that fancy Stanford degree entitles you to any special treatment." I felt my jaw tighten, a familiar surge of anger rising in my throat. A powerful instinct screamed at me to hang up, to finally and completely sever the toxic connection to him and the family that had caused me so much pain. But then, as clearly as if she were standing beside me, I heard my mother's voice in my mind. "You are so much stronger than you know." If I turned my back on this, I would be conceding defeat. I would be letting him win, validating his lifelong assessment of me as a worthless failure. I would not let that happen. I booked a flight back to Seattle, my luggage containing little more than a few changes of clothes and a will of iron. As I walked into the headquarters of BioCore Innovations, I was momentarily taken aback by its scale. The sleek glass tower shimmered in the afternoon sun, the company's logo etched into the facade with an air of sleek, formidable power. This was a far cry from the modest company I vaguely recalled from my childhood, from those rare occasions when my father would drag me to his office and order me to sit quietly in a corner and not touch anything. BioCore was now a dominant force in the biotech sphere. Its advanced diagnostic imaging systems and robotic surgical aids were standard in hospitals across the country. But I was also aware that beneath that polished, successful exterior, the company was in turmoil. I knew that my father's increasingly erratic decisions, combined with Leo's complete lack of interest and a dangerous sense of complacency, were causing the company to lose ground to its more agile competitors. On my first day, I was summoned to his office. He sat enthroned behind a massive mahogany desk, his expression as severe as ever, his eyes still holding that same cold, penetrating quality that could make a person feel utterly transparent. Leo stood near the window, now 22 years old and clad in a designer suit that probably cost more than my first car. His face wore the same familiar expression of smug self-satisfaction. "You'll be starting in the R&D department," my father announced, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "It's an entry-level role. Don't come to me looking for any special treatment." I simply nodded. keeping my expression neutral even though I knew this was a calculated move to humiliate me. An entry-level position for a Stanford MBA, while Leo, who had scraped through a second-rate university and never held a real job in his life, had been handed the title of marketing director. I shifted my gaze to my brother, who was enjoying this moment immensely, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "Welcome home, big brother," he said, his voice oozing with insincere sweetness. Those first few weeks at BioCore were an exercise in patience and restraint. I was assigned to a cramped cubicle in a forgotten corner of the research and development wing, surrounded by dedicated engineers and scientists who were working day in and day out to refine the company's core technologies. My new colleagues, most of them years my senior, regarded me with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. They knew who I was and they were waiting to see what I would do. They knew I was David Hayes' son, but it was also common knowledge that he held me in low regard. "You're Ethan, aren't you?" One of the senior engineers, a woman named Sophia, asked me on my second day. "I heard you went to Stanford. What are you doing down here with us?" I managed a weak smile and deflected the question. I had no desire to explain the twisted dynamics of my family, no intention of bearing the old wounds that still ached within me. My assigned tasks involved sifting through mountains of data from our medical devices, identifying potential areas for enhancement, and supporting the technical teams with their ongoing research. It was far from a high-profile job, but I found a quiet satisfaction in it. I loved the clarity of the work, the way the numbers and data points formed a narrative telling a story of their own. I was fascinated by the knowledge that every minor refinement, every incremental improvement had the potential to save someone's life. I poured myself into the work, often staying at my desk long after everyone else had gone home, the office silent and dark around me. I wasn't trying to get my father's attention. I was doing it for myself, to prove that I could contribute something meaningful. My efforts went completely unnoticed by him. During company-wide meetings, his focus was exclusively on Leo, who would present one half-baked marketing scheme after another, proposing extravagant advertising campaigns that were completely detached from any real market analysis or strategic thought. "Leo has vision," my father declared in one of those meetings, waving away a detailed proposal I had prepared for a critical technical upgrade to one of our key diagnostic tools. "You just focus on doing your job." His dismissive words no longer had the power to wound me as they once had. I had developed a thick callus over that particular nerve, but every time I saw Leo with that arrogant smirk and his lazy, entitled demeanor, a cold, quiet rage would ignite within me. He had not earned his position, and he was a liability to the company. I knew with a growing sense of urgency that I had to do something. I began to methodically build alliances within the company. I made a point of having lunch with the engineers in the cafeteria, asking them about their projects, listening to their frustrations, and absorbing their years of institutional knowledge. Sophia, the engineer who had first spoken to me, became a trusted confidant. She filled me in on the company's internal politics, the blatant favoritism my father showed Leo, and the series of costly financial blunders that had recently lost us several major contracts. "This place needs a leader like you, Ethan," Sophia told me one afternoon over coffee. "Not him." I smiled and thanked her for the vote of confidence, but I knew that talk was cheap. Words were not going to shift the balance of power. Only decisive action would. In the meantime, Leo continued to behave like a pampered heir. He would wander into the office around noon, leave by 3, and spend the majority of his time documenting his lavish, party-centric lifestyle for his social media followers. One afternoon, I happened to overhear him talking to one of the junior members of his marketing team. "This whole company will be mine one day," Leo said with absolute certainty. "My dad promised me." Ethan is just a glorified employee. I stood just out of sight, my hands balled into tight fists, a wave of fury washing over me. I had to consciously force myself to remain calm. The infuriating thing was he was right, at least in one respect. My father had always intended for Leo to inherit BioCore, but I also knew with chilling clarity that if Leo ever actually took the helm, he would run the company into the ground within a year. My interactions with my father became more and more tense. He refused to acknowledge any of my contributions, even when my data analysis led to process improvements that saved the company millions of dollars in manufacturing costs. In one executive meeting, I began to present a concept for a new, groundbreaking diagnostic device, and he cut me off mid-sentence. "Don't waste our time with these fantasy projects," he snapped. "Just do the work you're paid to do." I looked at him then, sitting at the head of the long conference table, and saw the same cold, dismissive eyes that had glared at me when I was a small boy. The same eyes that had looked at me when he'd called me a bastard. But something had shifted inside me. I was no longer afraid of him. I knew my own strength now. One evening I was working late as usual when Sophia appeared in the doorway of my cubicle, her expression grim. "Ethan, there's something you need to see," she said, her voice low. She proceeded to tell me that Leo had persuaded my father to sign a massive supply chain contract with a notoriously unreliable vendor. The deal was shady, and Leo was set to receive a substantial personal kickback for arranging it. If the supplier failed to deliver, which was highly likely, the company stood to lose tens of millions of dollars. Hearing this, my blood ran cold, then hot with anger. This was no longer just a personal grievance. This was about the survival of BioCore Innovations, the company that was, in its own way, a part of my mother's legacy, something she had hoped I would one day help to steward. I started my own covert investigation. I began meticulously reviewing financial statements, digging into past contracts, and analyzing the track record of decisions made by my father and Leo over the last several years. The picture that emerged was alarming. BioCore was in far more trouble than I had realized. Our competitors were innovating at a rapid pace, leaving us behind, and Leo's reckless incompetence was accelerating the decline. I knew I couldn't fix everything at once. But I also knew I could no longer afford to sit on the sidelines and watch them drive the company off a cliff. One night, sitting alone in my office long after dark, I looked out at the glittering expanse of the Seattle skyline and thought of my mother. She had always believed I was capable of great things. I pulled the old wooden box from my desk drawer, opened the lid, and began to read her letters again. Her handwriting, so familiar and comforting, seemed to reach out from the page. "You are my hope." In that quiet, solitary moment, a decision crystallized within me. I wasn't just going to work at BioCore Innovations, I was going to take control of it. Not for my father, not to spite Leo, but for my mother, and for myself. The months that followed were a grueling strategic campaign, demanding every ounce of my patience and resolve. I continued to excel at my official duties, but I spent every spare moment cultivating a network of supporters within the company. I knew I could never count on my father, but I could count on people like Sophia and the other dedicated engineers who shared my concerns and believed in my ability to right the ship. I also began a deep dive into the corporate structure of BioCore, how my father maintained his control of the board of directors, the distribution of shares, and the vulnerabilities in his leadership style. I started compiling a dossier, knowing that this information would be my ammunition when the time was right. All the while, Leo continued his destructive streak. He squandered millions on ill-conceived marketing stunts that yielded no results, and my father continued to blindly defend his every move. I finally reached a breaking point in one board meeting. After Leo presented yet another disastrously expensive plan, I could no longer remain silent. I spoke up, my voice cutting through the room. "If we continue with this level of reckless spending," I said, looking directly at my father, "we will alienate our investors and lose our market position." My father's head snapped toward me, his eyes blazing with fury. "What could you possibly know about running a business?" he snarled. Across the table, Leo chuckled as if I had just told a childish joke. It was in that moment that the final illusion shattered. I understood with absolute clarity that hard work and competence would never be enough. To change this company, to save it, I needed power. The kind of raw, institutional power that my father and Leo took for granted. And so, I made a new vow to myself. I would be patient. I would be meticulous. I would craft a detailed, step-by-step strategy to achieve my goal. But then something happened that I could never have foreseen. An unexpected revelation came to light, a secret that would shatter my understanding of my own life and force me to re-examine everything I thought I knew. It was a dreary October afternoon in Seattle, one of those days when a persistent drizzling rain blankets the city in a shroud of gray. I was at my desk, analyzing trial data from a new piece of diagnostic equipment, when my desk phone rang. It was a nurse from a local hospital, her voice calm but urgent. "Mr. Ethan Hayes," she said, "your father, David Hayes, has been brought into the emergency room. He's severely anemic and has just suffered a minor cardiac event. We need a family member to come in for a blood donation immediately." A knot of ice formed in my stomach. Despite the years of cruelty, despite the deep chasm between us, the thought of him dying was something I couldn't just dismiss. I couldn't abandon him. I raced to the hospital, a strange, unidentifiable anxiety churning within me. When I got there, I found my father in an intensive care unit bed, his face ashen, his eyes shut. He looked so small and fragile lying there. Leo was also present, but he was lurking in a corner, idly scrolling through his phone, looking more bored than concerned. I stared at the man in the bed, the architect of my childhood misery, now reduced to this helpless state. I couldn't identify the emotion swirling inside me. Was it anger, pity, or just a profound, hollow emptiness? A doctor entered the room and explained that my father required an immediate blood transfusion. He asked if either Leo or I would be willing to donate. "I'll do it," I said instantly without a second thought. Leo just shrugged and mumbled something about having a thing with needles. But when the results of my blood test came back, the doctor returned to the waiting area, his expression puzzled. "Ethan," he began, his voice lowered, "there's something strange. Your blood type is not a match for Mr. Hayes's. In fact, it's genetically impossible for you to be his biological son." His words struck me with the force of a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind struggling to process what I had just heard. What are you talking about?" I managed to stammer. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The doctor looked uncomfortable, clearly trying to be gentle. "Your blood type is AB positive," he explained. "Your father's is type O. From a genetic standpoint, it's not possible for a type O parent to have a type AB child. I'm sorry, but you cannot be his biological son." The sterile hospital floor seemed to dissolve beneath my feet. A chaotic whirlwind of memories flooded my mind. My father's voice, sharp and venomous, echoing through the years. "You bastard." The slaps, the insults, the endless looks of pure, undiluted contempt. It all clicked into place with a sickening finality. He knew. He had known all along. But if David Hayes was not my father, then who was I? And my mother, the one person whose love had been my only constant, was she even my mother? Or was my entire existence a lie? The most pressing question of all screamed in my mind, who was my real father? I stumbled out of the hospital in a complete fog, the world around me seeming unreal and distorted. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through my jacket, but I barely noticed. I drove back to my small apartment on autopilot, my mind a chaotic mess of unanswerable questions. When I got inside, I collapsed into a chair and just stared at the small wooden box on my desk, the box that held my mother's letters. I desperately wanted to open it, to tear through her letters in search of some clue, some answer to the questions that were tearing me apart. But I was paralyzed by fear. I was terrified that the truth, whatever it was, would destroy the one sacred thing I had left. The memory of my mother and the unwavering love she had shown me. My father was released from the hospital the following day. He never thanked me for coming, and he certainly never brought up the subject of the blood donation. But I couldn't just let it lie. I had to know the truth. I started my own secret investigation, moving with extreme caution to avoid raising any suspicion within the family. I reached out to a trusted friend from my Stanford days, who was now a partner at a law firm in the city. I asked for his help in discreetly accessing old family medical records and other personal documents. At the same time, I hired a private investigator, a quiet, methodical man named Frank, to start digging into my parents' history. The next few weeks were a blur of intense, nerve-wracking anxiety. During the day, I went to work at BioCore, maintaining a carefully constructed mask of normalcy, acting as if nothing was wrong. But at night, I would obsessively study the documents and reports Frank sent me, trying to assemble the scattered pieces of my family's past into a coherent narrative. One of the first things I uncovered was that my parents had gotten married just 3 months before I was born. A small but significant detail that I had never known. But the discovery that truly shook me to my core was an old medical file that Frank unearthed from a dusty hospital archive in downtown Seattle. It was a record of my mother being hospitalized a year before I was born, suffering from severe injuries sustained during a violent assault. I read the clinical, detached language of the report again and again, each word a hammer blow to my heart. It detailed her injuries and noted that she had been attacked by an unknown assailant but had refused to press charges or provide the police with any details. A sharp, physical pain shot through my chest. My mother, my gentle, kind mother, whose smile was my most cherished memory, had suffered through something so terrible. And then a horrifying thought took root in my mind, a possibility so monstrous I could barely let myself form the words. Was I the product of that brutal attack? Was that the real reason my father had always called me a bastard? I didn't want to accept it, but the puzzle pieces were snapping together with sickening logic. My father's lifelong loathing of me, the way he had always treated me as a shameful secret, and my mother's fierce, almost desperate love for me, it all suddenly had a dark, tragic explanation. I sat there in my silent apartment, my hands shaking uncontrollably, tears blurring my vision and streaming down my cheeks. But I wasn't crying for myself. I was crying for my mother, for the unimaginable pain and secrets she must have carried all those years. She had survived that horror and had still chosen to bring me into this world, to love me, to shield me with every ounce of her being, as if I were the most precious thing in her life. I had to confront him. One evening, I drove to his house, the sprawling Medina estate where I had spent so many years living in fear. I found him where I knew he would be, in the living room, a glass of scotch in his hand. Leo was nowhere to be seen, likely out somewhere squandering more of the family's money. I walked into the room and stood before him. I took a deep, steadying breath. "I'm not your biological son, am I?" I asked, my voice surprisingly level. The atmosphere in the room instantly became thick and heavy. He looked up at me, his eyes growing dark, but he didn't speak right away. The silence stretched on, suffocating and tense. Finally he spoke, his voice as cold as ice. "If you already know the answer, why are you asking the question?" His dismissive words were like a physical blow, but I refused to back down. "Did Mom know?" I pressed, my voice shaking slightly despite my efforts to control it. "What did she tell you about me?" A bitter, humorless smile twisted his lips. "Clara loved you more than anything in this world," he said. "But she never wanted you to find out the truth. She always said it didn't matter where you came from. You were her son, and that was all that mattered." His words were a strange cocktail of agony and release, a sharp blade that both wounded and set me free. I had so many more questions, a desperate need to know all the details, but he got to his feet and turned his back on me, a clear dismissal. "Don't go digging around in the past, Ethan," he said over his shoulder. "It won't change a thing." I left his house that night with my mind in a state of turmoil. The confirmation that David Hayes was not my biological father explained everything. His decades of hatred, his blatant favoritism toward Leo, and the fierce protective nature of my mother's love. But this new knowledge also left me standing at a critical juncture. I could walk away from it all, sever every tie to this toxic family, and build a new life for myself somewhere else, completely unencumbered. Or I could stay and fight for control of BioCore, not just for my own ambition, but for the memory of the woman who had given up everything to keep me safe. In the end, I chose to stay. I can't recall the exact reasoning that led me to that decision in that moment. Maybe it was a burning desire for some kind of cosmic justice. Maybe it was a cold, calculated plan to make my father and brother pay for their cruelty. Or maybe it was a combination of both. I'm not entirely sure. All I know is that when I look back on it now, from this vantage point, I believe I made the right choice. I went back to work at BioCore the next day and acted as if nothing had changed. On the outside, I was the same quiet, diligent employee. But on the inside, a detailed plan was taking shape, and I immediately began to set the first pieces in motion. To everyone at the company, I was still just a junior staffer in the R&D department, but I now saw that lowly position as a strategic asset. It made me invisible. No one was watching me. No one considered me a threat. My father was consumed with his high-level corporate maneuvering, and Leo was absorbed in his own hedonistic pursuits. While they were distracted, I was quietly and methodically laying the groundwork for a corporate coup. I dedicated myself to learning every single facet of the company's operations. I studied the intricacies of our product development pipeline, pored over financial reports and vendor contracts, and memorized the shareholder registry and the bylaws that govern my father's control of the board. Every scrap of data, no matter how insignificant it seemed, was another piece of the complex puzzle I was putting together. I also continued to strengthen my network of allies within the company, understanding that I could not succeed on my own. My time spent in the trenches of the R&D department had proven invaluable, allowing me to build genuine relationships with the people who were the true heart of the company. Sophia, the lead engineer who had befriended me from the beginning, was the first person I brought into my confidence. One evening, after the office had emptied out, I asked her to join me for a drink at a quiet bar near the office. In the dim, warm light of the little tavern, I laid out my case. Not the personal details of my parentage, but my professional assessment of BioCore's future. "Sophia," I began, my voice quiet but intense, "you see what's happening here, don't you? You see the direction this company is heading. Leo's incompetence, my father's refusal to adapt. They're going to destroy everything." Sophia looked at me, her expression serious. "I know," she said with a sigh. "I've been with this company for 15 years, Ethan. I remember when we were the most innovative firm in the industry. Now, Now it feels like we're just treading water, waiting to go under." She took a sip of her wine and then looked at me intently. "You have a plan, don't you?" I allowed myself a small, tight smile, but I didn't answer her directly. Instead, I posed a question of my own. If I had a way to turn things around, I asked, "Would you be with me?" Sophia held my gaze for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks. Then she gave a firm, decisive nod. "If you can show me you have a real chance of succeeding," she said, "I'll back you 100%. That was the first critical piece falling into place. Sophia was more than just a brilliant engineer. She was a respected leader within the R&D division, and her endorsement would carry significant weight with her colleagues. With her on board, I began to cautiously expand my circle of allies. I was meticulous in my approach, careful to avoid raising any red flags. I continued my routine of eating in the company cafeteria, making myself an approachable sounding board for the engineers, absorbing their complaints and committing every operational detail to memory. I quickly discovered that the discontent with Leo was widespread, extending far beyond the R&D team. From long-serving veterans to ambitious mid-level managers, a common frustration simmered just below the surface. People were tired of his profligate spending and his strategy-free seat-of-the-pants decision-making. I never once voiced my own criticisms of Leo or my father. I didn't have to. I simply created a space for others to share their own frustrations, and I listened intently. Each one of those conversations was another piece of intelligence, another block in the foundation of my plan. The next crucial phase involved re-establishing my connection with Robert Sterling, the venture capitalist father of my old Stanford classmate. We had spoken a handful of times during my university years, and I knew that his support would be indispensable. Robert was a legendary investor with a vast and diverse portfolio that included major holdings in both technology and biotech. He had an uncanny ability to see potential where others saw only risk, and I was certain that if I could get him to believe in my vision, I would secure a formidable ally. I booked a flight to San Francisco and met with him at his office, an impressive space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Golden Gate Bridge. He welcomed me with a warm but perceptive smile, as if he could already tell that this was more than a social call. "Ethan," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "You don't strike me as the kind of young man who flies all this way just to catch up over coffee. What's on your mind?" I took a moment to compose myself, and then I laid out my entire strategy. I walked him through BioCore's current predicament, detailing my father's strategic errors and Leo's reckless mismanagement. I also painted a picture of the company's untapped potential, what it could become under competent leadership. I showed him the preliminary work on several projects I had been developing in secret, including a concept for an AI-driven diagnostic platform that had the potential to be a true game-changer in the medical field. But to make any of this a reality, I concluded, looking him directly in the eye, I need to gain control of the company, and to do that, I need your help. Robert Sterling raised a skeptical eyebrow, but I could also see a flicker of genuine interest in his eyes. "And what exactly," he asked, leaning forward slightly, "do you need from me?" I explained my plan. I needed him to begin acquiring a significant stake in BioCore, but to do so covertly through a series of shell corporations so as not to alert my father. In exchange for his investment, I would provide him with carefully timed insider intelligence, advance notice of new product launches or major contract signings that would predictably drive up the stock price. "And when the moment is right," I finished, "I will need you to use that leverage to support my bid for leadership in the boardroom." Robert tapped his fingers rhythmically on his polished desk, his expression unreadable. He was silent for a long moment. "You're playing a very dangerous game, Ethan," he said finally. "If your father catches wind of this, you'll be finished." I met his gaze without flinching. "I know," I said, "but if I do nothing, Leo will drive this company into the ground. I can't stand by and let that happen." A slow smile spread across Robert's face, a look that was equal parts admiration and warning. "All right, son," he said, extending a hand across the desk. "I'm in, but you damn well better deliver on your promises." That was the moment the tide began to turn. With Robert Sterling's financial backing, I started to quietly assemble a shadow coalition of shareholders. Every time I knew BioCore was about to release positive news, I would give him the signal. He would then execute a series of strategic stock purchases through his network of anonymous entities, with a percentage of those shares being funneled into a trust that was registered under a false name but was ultimately under my control. It was a high-wire act, and I was acutely aware that I was operating in a gray ethical area. But I saw no other path forward. My father and Leo would never voluntarily give up their power. To wrest control from them, I had to be willing to use every weapon in my arsenal. The plan was fraught with peril. My father, for all his faults, was a cunning and suspicious man. He monitored the company's major shareholders with an eagle eye. And I knew that if he got even a whiff of what I was doing, he would not hesitate to destroy me. I had to be flawless in my execution, erasing every digital footprint and maintaining my cover as a dutiful, unassuming employee. I had a close call once during a tense meeting. My father was questioning me about a financial analysis I had prepared. "You seem to know an awful lot about the company's stock performance for a junior engineer," he said, his eyes boring into me, searching for any sign of deception. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my voice to remain calm and steady. "I just want to learn as much as I can about the business, sir," I replied, meeting his gaze. "If I'm going to make a real contribution here, I need to understand the big picture." He held my gaze for another long moment, then gave a curt nod, seemingly satisfied. But I knew, in that instant, that his suspicion had been aroused. Leo, in the meantime, continued to be my unwitting accomplice. On one memorable occasion, he unilaterally signed a $5 million advertising contract with a fly-by-night media agency, solely because its founder was one of his favorite drinking companions. The campaign was an unmitigated disaster and resulted in the loss of one of our most important clients. I seized the opportunity, carefully documenting every misstep, from the initial email exchanges to the final dismal financial reports. I knew that Leo's incompetence was the ammunition I would need for the final battle, but the constant pressure and deception took a toll. There were nights when I would sit alone in my apartment and the crushing weight of my isolation would feel unbearable. I would think of my mother, take out her letters, and wonder what she would think of the man I was becoming. I was playing a ruthless game, and I was terrified that in my quest for power I was slowly transforming into a mirror image of my father, cold, calculating, and willing to do whatever it took to win. But then I would remember her smile, and her words would echo in my mind, "You are my hope." And I would tell myself that this wasn't about power or revenge, this was about justice. A decade can feel like an eternity, and it can also pass in the blink of an eye. Looking back on those 10 years, I can barely recognize the man I was at the beginning. The frightened, uncertain young man had been forged in the crucible of corporate warfare into a 36-year-old executive, now unofficially leading the entire product development division of BioCore Innovations, though my official title remained that of a mid-level manager. But that unassuming job description was a carefully maintained camouflage. Behind it lay a decade-long strategic campaign, a high-stakes chess match where every move had been planned years in advance. BioCore, which had been teetering on the brink of irrelevance, had been transformed into a titan of the medical technology sector, its valuation now soaring past the billion-dollar mark. This dramatic turnaround was not the result of my father's leadership or Leo's non-existent contributions. It was the product of my own relentless drive and the efforts of the loyal, brilliant team I had secretly assembled around me. The AI-driven diagnostic platform I had first conceived of all those years ago had become the company's signature product, revolutionizing early cancer detection. With a diagnostic accuracy rate exceeding 95%, the system was now in high demand at major medical centers all over the world, from North America to Europe and the Far East. Other groundbreaking products, like our line of robotic surgical assistants and our remote patient monitoring network, also originated from my strategic vision. Though my father, of course, never publicly gave me credit. I worked around the clock not just on product innovation, but on cultivating a culture of excellence and loyalty within my division. Sophia, my first and most trusted ally, had become my de facto second in command. She managed the technical teams with a brilliant combination of expertise and empathy, and together we transformed BioCore into a beacon of cutting-edge innovation. Gradually, other key employees throughout the company, from the engineering labs to the sales floor, began to look to me for real leadership, even as my father and Leo officially remained in charge. I never made a direct move against them, but I took a quiet satisfaction in knowing that every one of our successes was a silent rebuke to their incompetence and arrogance. Leo, meanwhile, continued to play the part of the indolent heir. Now 32, he still held the title of marketing director, but his only notable accomplishments were a string of spectacularly expensive and completely ineffective advertising campaigns that did nothing to move the needle on sales. My father, now well into his 60s, still reigned as the chairman of the board, his authority seemingly absolute. But I could see the signs that he was losing his edge. His judgment had become rigid, his grasp of emerging technologies was weak, and his blind faith in Leo caused the company to repeatedly miss out on crucial market opportunities. Over the course of that decade, I had steadily and silently amassed my own base of power, not through overt confrontation, but through a series of carefully orchestrated maneuvers. My alliance with Robert Sterling, the venture capitalist I had courted all those years ago, remained the bedrock of my strategy. Through his network of shell corporations, Robert now controlled a 19% stake in BioCore, while the trust I controlled held another 17%. It was a substantial block, but it still wasn't enough to challenge my father, who maintained a controlling interest of over 50% through a combination of his personal holdings and the unwavering loyalty of a handful of old guard shareholders. So for 10 years, I had patiently and persistently cultivated relationships with the company's other investors. In quiet, informal conversations, I would share my vision for BioCore's future. A future where we were not just a market leader in profitability, but also a driving force for positive social change in global healthcare. I would talk about the real-world impact of our AI diagnostic platform, about the thousands of lives it had already saved, and then I would gently pivot to the millions of dollars that Leo's blunders had cost the company. We need a leader who will always put the company's long-term interests above all else, I said to one influential shareholder. A man who had been an early investor in BioCore. He nodded his head in agreement. "You're right, Ethan," he said, his expression somber. "David did a great job building this company, but he's not the man to lead it into the future." One by one, I slowly won over a coalition of the smaller, independent shareholders. They were tired of my father's blatant nepotism and his stubborn refusal to embrace the very innovations that were keeping the company afloat. I knew that when the time for the final confrontation arrived, their collective votes would be my most powerful weapon. That moment finally came on a bright morning in May, at the annual BioCore shareholder meeting. A week before the meeting, my father had made a stunning announcement. He would be stepping down as CEO and appointing Leo as his successor. The news sent shockwaves through the company, and the halls were filled with the quiet, anxious whispers of worried employees and disgruntled investors. Leo, predictably, was reveling in his impending coronation. He had prepared a long, self-congratulatory speech for the meeting, a revisionist history of his supposed accomplishments that conveniently omitted his litany of failed campaigns and disastrous deals. I knew that the time for subtlety was over. This was my opening. A few days before the meeting, I met with Robert Sterling at a private club in downtown Seattle. "Are we ready?" I asked, my own heart thumping with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Robert gave me a confident smile, his eyes sharp and focused. "You've played this perfectly, Ethan," he said. "Between us, we control 36% of the voting shares. I've also had quiet conversations with a dozen of the smaller independent investors. They're with us." I nodded, a profound sense of gravity settling over me. This was it, the final decisive move in a chess game that had been a decade in the making. I could not afford a single misstep. On the morning of the shareholder meeting, the main conference room at BioCore headquarters was filled to capacity. The entire spectrum of the company's ownership was present, from major institutional investors to individual stakeholders, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. My father stood at the podium, dressed in an impeccably tailored dark suit, still radiating an aura of command despite his advancing years. Leo sat beside him at the head table, a smug, triumphant grin plastered on his face, as if his ascension to the throne was a foregone conclusion. I had taken a seat in the back of the room, a silent observer, but inside me a tempest was gathering. My father began his address, launching into a glowing tribute to Leo, painting him as some kind of visionary business prodigy. "Leo has proven his leadership capabilities time and time again," he declared, his voice thick with a father's misguided pride. "He is the man who will lead BioCore innovations into a bold new era." A smattering of polite applause followed, but I saw that many of the investors in the room remained silent, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. Then came the bombshell. "I am therefore proposing Leo Hayes as our next CEO," my father announced, "and I will be transferring the majority of my personal shares to him upon my retirement." A palpable tension filled the room. The air grew thick with unspoken objections. This was my cue. I rose to my feet. "I object," I said, my voice ringing out clear and firm in the sudden silence. Every head in the room swiveled in my direction. My father froze at the podium, his face contorting with disbelief and rage. Leo let out a nervous, incredulous laugh, but his smile vanished as I made my way to the front of the room and stepped up to the microphone. "To BioCore Innovations," I began, my voice calm but carrying the weight of years of preparation, "is standing on the edge of a precipice. Under Leo Hayes' direction, the marketing department has made a series of catastrophic errors. From wasting millions on ineffective advertising to entering into contracts with disreputable partners. These mistakes have cost this company dearly, not just in financial terms, but in market share and reputation." I pulled a thick binder from my briefcase and placed it on the lectern. The dossier I had been compiling for a decade. It contained copies of Leo's incriminating emails, internal financial reports detailing the losses from his failed projects, and sworn affidavits from former employees. I walked the shareholders through the evidence, point by damning point, leaving no room for ambiguity. "Meanwhile," I continued, my voice rising with passion, "our brilliant technical teams have been developing products that are fundamentally changing the face of modern medicine. Our AI diagnostic platform is saving lives every single day. That is the reason BioCore is valued at over $1 billion. But we cannot allow incompetent, self-serving leadership to squander that potential and drive this company into the ground. My father shot to his feet, his face flushed with a deep crimson rage. "How dare you?" he bellowed, his voice shaking with uncontrolled fury. "How dare you stand there and challenge me?" I met his enraged glare without flinching. "I am not challenging you, David," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I am protecting this company, the company that my mother loved and believed in." The mention of my mother seemed to land a blow. He faltered for a moment, and I saw a flicker of something, pain, regret, in his eyes. But I pressed my advantage. "I personally control 17% of this company's shares," I announced, and a wave of surprised murmurs rippled through the audience. "And I have the full support of Mr. Robert Sterling, who controls another 19%, as well as the backing of numerous other concerned shareholders." On cue, Robert Sterling stood up and nodded his assent. He was followed by several of the other independent investors I had cultivated, each one voicing their support for a change in leadership. The room was now buzzing with energy. Leo was in a full-blown panic, sputtering incoherently. You can't do this," he stammered, his face pale. "This company is supposed to be mine." I ignored him completely, my focus entirely on the shareholders. I laid out my vision for the future of BioCore, a company that would not just dominate the market but would lead the world in developing life-saving technologies. A company free from the shackles of nepotism and poor judgment. At the end of my presentation, I made my move. I formally proposed a shareholder vote to remove David Hayes from his positions as CEO and chairman of the board. In the same motion, I called for the immediate termination of Leo Hayes' employment as marketing director. A tense, hushed silence fell over the room as the vote was called. The conference room descended into a heavy silence, punctuated only by the quiet rustling of papers and the low whispers of the shareholders. When the votes had been collected and counted, the corporate secretary walked to the podium to deliver the verdict. I stood at my place, my hands gripping the edge of the conference table so tightly my knuckles were white. I fought to keep my expression neutral, but my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I could feel every eye in the room on me. Robert Sterling in the front row gave me a subtle, encouraging smile. The other investors I had won over nodded at me in solidarity, but the only gaze that mattered was my father's. His cold, penetrating eyes, which had haunted me my entire life, were now filled with a mixture of disbelief and an emotion I had never seen in them before. Utter helplessness. With a clear majority of the votes, the secretary's voice announced, crisp and devoid of emotion, "The motion carries. Mr. David Hayes is hereby removed from his positions as CEO and chairman of the board. Mr. Leo Hayes is terminated from his role as director of marketing, effective immediately. In their place," she continued, "Mr. Ethan Hayes has been elected as the new president and chairman of the board of BioCore Innovations." A wave of sound broke through the room, a mixture of scattered, enthusiastic applause and shocked gasps. Robert Sterling stood up and raised a hand in a gesture of congratulations. Sophia, who had been sitting quietly in the back, was beaming, her eyes shining with pride. But I couldn't bring myself to smile. My eyes were locked on my father. He slowly rose from his chair, his face a mask of crimson fury. His hands were trembling, and for a moment I thought he was going to lunge across the table and strike me, just as he had done so many times when I was a boy. But he didn't. He just stood there, glaring at me, his eyes burning with a rage that was mingled with a profound, unfamiliar pain. Without saying a word, he turned and strode out of the conference room, his footsteps heavy and defeated. The heavy door swung shut behind him, the sound echoing like a final, definitive punctuation mark on the end of his long and tyrannical reign. Leo, who had been sitting beside him, looked like a cornered animal. his face a mess of panic and confusion. His face was ashen, his lips drawn into a thin, tight line. His blue eyes, the same eyes that had been the source of my father's adoration and my own private hell, were now wide with fear. He staggered to his feet unsteady and shot me a look of pure, venomous hatred. "You will regret this," he hissed, his voice low and menacing, meant only for me to hear. I didn't bother to respond. I just stood there and watched him hurry after our father. His once confident swagger replaced by a pathetic, stumbling gait. As the door swung shut for a second time, the room erupted in a genuine, sustained round of applause. Robert Sterling came up to the podium and clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Ethan," he said, his voice filled with sincere admiration. One by one, the other shareholders came forward to shake my hand, their faces full of hope and congratulations. But I felt no sense of triumph. My heart was still pounding, not with exhilaration, but with a strange, hollow ache. I had won. I had achieved the goal I had been working toward for a decade. I had overthrown my father and my brother. I had claimed BioCore Innovations for myself. So why did I feel as if in my moment of ultimate victory I had lost something essential and irreplaceable? That night I sat alone in the president's office, the cavernous room that had once been my father's inner sanctum. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows provided a stunning panoramic view of the Seattle skyline, the city lights glittering below like a carpet of fallen stars. I slowly swiveled in the enormous leather chair, staring out at the view, trying to summon the feeling of triumph I had always imagined I would feel in this moment. BioCore Innovations was mine, not just the title but the legacy itself, which I had single-handedly rescued from the brink of ruin. In 10 years, I had rebuilt the company from a floundering enterprise into a billion-dollar powerhouse, with products like our AI diagnostic platform saving countless lives all over the globe. I had proven beyond any doubt that I was not the shameful secret my father had always treated me as, nor the incompetent fool Leo had always mocked. But any flicker of pride I felt was immediately extinguished by a familiar, suffocating wave of loneliness. I pulled the old wooden box from one of the desk drawers, the box that had been my constant companion for so many years. Inside lay my mother's letters, their pages soft and yellowed with age, yet still seeming to carry the faint, comforting scent of her perfume. I carefully unfolded one and read the familiar, elegant script. "You are my hope." Tears began to well up in my eyes, not tears of sadness, but of a deep, aching longing to hear her voice one more time, to ask her if she was proud of the man I had become. Everything I had done, every sacrifice I had made had been for her, for the boundless love she had given me, for the legacy I felt she had entrusted me to protect. But now, standing at the summit of my ambition, I couldn't help but wonder, was this what she would have wanted? My thoughts turned to my father, to the look of stunned helplessness on his face as he walked out of that conference room. In spite of the decades of cruelty, in spite of the fact that he had never been a real father to me, I felt a strange, unexpected twinge of something that felt like pity as I watched him fall from grace. And Leo, the brother I had once foolishly hoped might one day accept me, was now nothing more than a bitter, resentful ghost. The fractured remains of my family were now completely and irrevocably shattered. I didn't regret my actions, but I could not ignore the price I had paid. I had traded my last tenuous connections to my family for what I hoped was a form of justice. Under my leadership, BioCore Innovations entered a new phase of growth and innovation. One of my first official acts was to promote Sophia to the position of Chief Technology Officer, giving her the authority and the resources she needed to drive our most ambitious research projects forward. We launched a series of groundbreaking new products, From a next-generation version of our AI platform to a new suite of 5G-enabled remote monitoring systems, hospitals around the world lined up to place record-breaking orders, and BioCore's stock price skyrocketed. We were featured on the cover of Fortune and profiled in the Wall Street Journal. My investors, from Robert Sterling to the smallest individual shareholder, hailed me as the company's savior. But I never let the adulation go to my head. I knew that to stay at the top, I had to remain vigilant, to never stop working, never stop learning, and never forget the lessons my mother had taught me about resilience and character. But every evening when I returned to the same modest apartment I had lived in for years, even though I could now easily afford a lavish estate, I was confronted with the hollow truth that my victory felt strangely incomplete. I would sit by the window looking out at the city lights, and my mind would drift back over the years. I would remember the long, lonely nights spent wrestling with my own doubts, the moments when I had come so close to giving up, and the constant steadying memory of my mother, the woman whose love had given me the strength to get back on my feet after every fall. I would open the old wooden box, my fingers gently tracing the familiar lines of her handwriting, and I would whisper into the quiet of the room, "I did it, Mom. I hope I made you proud." I knew that the path forward would not be easy. My father and Leo would likely never forgive me, and our competitors would be constantly nipping at our heels, trying to steal our market share. But for the first time in my life, I was not afraid. I had learned that real strength isn't found in power or riches, but in the quiet, stubborn resilience that allows you to climb back up from the depths of your deepest pain. And as long as I had my mother's letters, I knew I would never truly be alone.